Just lighting some sage and cedar incense, and then we'll get started. All right. Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. Today's subject is bioethics. This might not seem like an esoteric topic on the face of it, but I think it is. It's a relatively arcane subject. You generally only hear about bioethics in college classrooms or corporate boardrooms or hospital board meetings or in certain think tanks. But more and more people are beginning to think about bioethics, especially considering the last 3 years and the sort of medical tyranny that has tried to impose itself on all of us around the world. It's become more popular to talk about what is right and wrong in the world of advancements in medicine and biological technologies, and how they should be applied to people, or how they should be seen by culture or adapted in general. I think it's a good thing that more and more people are being interested in bioethics, especially today, because there are a lot more advances in medical technologies that could result in more abuses or even in misunderstandings. And the world of bioethics is a little bit limited because most medical researchers consider the human being to be nothing more than a collection of atoms, right? Just matter. There's no soul, there's no ether, there's no life force, there's no mind, there's no spirit in the world of biomedical research, at least not in the mainstream research. I'm sure there are some super secretive corporations and military projects that take these things into account, but generally speaking, when we're dealing with biomedical technology corporations, hospitals, doctors' offices, universities, and so on, we are generally dealing with materialistic people who don't believe in spiritual things. And this has greatly limited the scope of bioethics. So basically, when I think of bioethics, when I first began studying bioethics, maybe 15, 18 years ago, was when I began thinking about the concept of transhumanism. Transhumanism and bioethics are sister subjects, if you will. You can't really think of one without thinking of the other. Or if you do think of one without thinking of the other, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Because of all these modern advancements in technology, transhumanism is less and less a theory and more an actual living reality. Transhumanist modalities, therapies, and applications are becoming more and more possible, more real. Some of them actually already exist. You know, we eat genetically modified foods. We have pretty advanced prosthetics. In the 1990s, the so-called age of the brain, we developed brain-computer interfaces where people could plug electrodes directly into their gray matter and begin controlling computers, typing words, moving the cursor around, even moving robotic arms that were, in another room, just connected to electrodes implanted in their brains. And that was in the early 90s that people started doing that. I'm sure the military started doing it as early as the 1960s. So we need to re-examine a certain fundamental assumptions about bioethics, because by the 1950s or 60s, the world of bioethics kind of fell asleep. It kind of thought, oh, we figured everything out. We know what's ethical and what's not. We're good. And then in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot more pharmaceuticals coming around. In the 90s, the age of the brain and brain-computer interfaces came around. Now today, people are talking about genetic alterations. People are now trying to change their fundamental identities as people. We have the transgender movement and the sex change operations that go on. And there's now a whole new world of bioethics that has opened up. and it needs to be re-examined. That, oh, we actually didn't figure out what is ethical and what is not ethical in the world of medicine. We completely missed the point. And a lot of our bioethical textbooks need to be rewritten. Some of them are pretty good. Others assumed we hammered out all the details already decades ago. But with the onset of these new technologies, the ethical assumptions we have about medicine need to be re-examined. And many people in the population have subconsciously realized, or consciously in many cases, have realized that bioethics needs to be re-examined because we saw the medical tyranny that is trying to impose itself upon us these days. And this is tied in with all sorts of things that are coming down the pike, all sorts of new medical technologies and things like that that are not only in the near future but exist today. And when you think of bioethics and transhumanism, they kind of go together, obviously, and you can't really think of one without the other. So there's a lot these days, it's a big trend to just kind of think about transhumanism. You know, you see new album artwork of musicians that come out with these like half robot, half human people on the covers. It's just like it's like trendy to be a transhumanist these days. We kind of experienced this in the 90s with all the cyberpunk movies and video games that came out back then, and it's coming around again. But in this way, it's a bit stronger. Transhumanists have been given a kind of soapbox to stand on for about the last 30 years. And most people didn't really notice it back in the day, but they're starting to notice it more now. That transhumanists are given a real spotlight and are given a freedom to really share their ideas. Now, humans interact with technology, humans interact with their environment, and the way we interact with our environment is different. The way we think about technology is different from person to person, from group to group. There are, primitivists, transhumanists, Luddites, Burkean conservatives, computer scientists, futurists, Mennonites. They're all different types of people that have all different types of opinions about technology and how we use it, how we should use it. And there are extremists on the sides, and then more balanced perspectives in between. And the extremists are primitivists on the one side, who hate all technology, want to live as though we are in the Neolithic era, and they are recognized as extremists. They're pretty obvious. When they start ranting about their beliefs, we understand that they have extremist, unbalanced beliefs because they're talking about going to a way of life that is essentially unachievable and is far more difficult to live that way than it's worth. And we kind of just ignore them. We recognize that they're extremists. It's fine. There's always going to be extremists in this world. It's just kind of a fact of life. And we leave them to their groups. They can live in their small, intentional, Neolithic-style communities, and they can plot the overthrow of industrial civilization, whatever. They're kind of just like a nuisance, and we recognize them as extremists, and they're not really a threat. But on the other side, the side that loves technology, the extremists on the other side are transhumanists. And they have not been recognized as extremists. They are seen as futurists, as innovators, as disruptors, as they're called in Silicon Valley. Disruptors of the status quo. They're seen as brave and adventurous and intelligent, and they give us all these promises of health and wealth and prosperity and happiness and the indulgence of our wildest dreams and desires as humans. They promise this great, bright, transhuman future. And they share their opinions and theories as though they're facts. They've been on extremely popular radio shows and news programs like 60 Minutes and podcasts and all sorts of things for 30 years now. And journalists, so-called professional journalists, always give them these softball questions. They never challenge the beliefs of these transhumanists. Maybe they did in the early 90s when it was kind of a new thing and these journalists were a little wary. But even then, I've seen the interviews on Ray Kurzweil from the late 80s, early 90s, and even then those journalists were not really challenging his beliefs, and they kind of just went along with them as though they were true. That, this technology is going to cure all of our ills and make everything better. And no one really challenged that assumption that in the future, everything's going to be better through the application of transhuman technologies. And when you listen to these interviews, these transhumanists, as they talk, they sound more like missionary priests that are trying to convert the masses to their new cult. Because they're prophesying about the future. They're saying, oh, if you believe in this, then these diseases will be cured, you'll live forever, you'll not have any problems, your life will be great, you get to do all these things. This technology will let you do that, this technology will let you do that. You can resurrect your ancestors, in a digital way. You just upload all your photos and videos of them and information about them, and we can create like a digital ancestor that you can communicate with. And if you apply these technologies to you, then you can live for 1,000 years and you'll never have any diseases. And it's been theoretical. These technologies don't really exist. The ones that do exist have only seen limited success in clinical studies and experimentation. And most of what transhumanists talk about is theoretical. It's not factual. Or at least we don't know yet whether or not it's factual. So they have this dogmatic view of their own beliefs, and they've managed to convince people. Wow, these incense are going crazy. They've managed to convince people that what they're saying is true. And it's sort of like the way a magician or a fraudulent psychic kind of gets you to believe certain things before they perform their trick. And they make it seem like you've always had these beliefs. They use charismatic and logical tricks and linguistic tricks to put some to implant some ideas into your head, make it seem like what they're about to do is totally natural and logical. And then they perform the trick, and you're more likely to believe them, to be impressed by them, to even thank them for the experience. It's like the argument that transhumanists have that if you use a rock to smash open an oyster, then you are in fact a transhumanist. I've heard this argument, I think it was first postulated back in the late 1980s, but it became popular in the early 2000s. Saying that if you use any technology at all, even a rock to smash open an oyster, a shovel to dig a hole, then this makes you a transhumanist. This is that trick that fraudulent psychics and stage magicians use to make you think, oh, what they're talking about is totally natural and normal. It's a linguistic trick, because I think it's complete exaggeration. I don't think if you use a shovel, you're a transhumanist. That's nonsense. There's a difference between using a shovel and putting a microchip in your brain. They argue that you used an object that was outside of yourself, that was not part of your body, and you merged with it to perform a task with ease that, without the tool, would have been very difficult. It's easier to use a shovel to dig a hole than your fingernails. And so because you used a shovel, you have extended the capabilities of your body using material technology, therefore, you are a transhumanist. But using a shovel is not the same thing as cutting off your arm and replacing it with a mechanical arm. It's just not the same thing. Using a computer on your desktop, typing with your fingers, clicking with a mouse, is not the same thing as putting the computer inside of the gray matter of your brain. It's just not the same thing. Just because I use a rock to smash open an oyster doesn't mean I'm eventually going to modify my genetics, swallow a bunch of pharmaceuticals that make me smarter, and start putting microchips in my brain. it's not a logical extension. They want you to think it is a logical extension. That if you use any tools at all, you will eventually be putting microchips in your brain and modifying your genetics, as though transhumanism is the extension of developing technology, as if it is a natural human impulse, that we move from using rocks and flint axes and metal shovels and computers to becoming the technology, or to utterly merging our physical selves with the technology. They want to conflate the two. They want to say that one is the natural progression of the other. I don't see why that should be the case. I don't ever intend on modifying my genes or modifying the genes of my unborn children. I don't intend to do it, because it's not a natural extension to me. Yes, I will go out in my garden, just outside here, and I will dig a hole with a shovel. I will do that. That does not make me a transhumanist. And it's absurd to make that logical leap. So this is why the world of bioethics has opened up again. Because many people have realized that this leap of logic is a bit hyperbolic. It's an exaggeration, and it needs to be re-examined. Because with advances in genetic sciences, people are now talking about the potential of creating designer babies, as they're called, where you can pick and choose the traits you want for your kid. You can avoid the likelihood of them having congenital diseases or even being susceptible to other diseases later in life and things of this nature. You know, imagine if you could genetically design a child. Because this has been popular news, popular science news for maybe 10 years now, people have reopened the bioethics school of thinking to re-examine whether or not we should really be doing these things. When thinking about something like a designer baby, of course you can remember that science fiction film from the 90s, Gattaca, with Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman and Jude Law. It's a pretty good movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Where if you... Let's take... There are two different groups of parents, right? And I'm sure we've all gone to school with a kid, with someone, with a classmate, whose parents offered them only conditional love. Not unconditional love, but conditional love. Meaning, I'm sure you can remember some student, some classmate you went to school with who just had the worst parents. Their parents would only love them and cherish them if they performed well in school, got A+, performed well in sports or in extracurricular activities later in life, if they performed well in the workforce. If they performed poorly or not up to their parents' expectations, they would be punished, ridiculed, just left out in the cold in a loveless relationship with their family. And I mean, there's 100 years of psychological and sociological studies to show that children like this grow up to be pretty awful, broken, rotten adults. Children who have only experienced conditional love tend to be traumatized and broken people in adulthood. And then there are parents who give their children unconditional love, where that child will be loved no matter what. Now imagine these strict parents had the opportunity to genetically modify their child before it was born. That they could make sure he would grow up to be 6 foot 2 inches tall and strong, that he would have musical talent, or he'd be an intelligent scientist or the greatest mathematician, or he would be a great athlete. He would, never get sick. He would have no congenital diseases or handicaps of any kind, and all that sort of thing. Now let's imagine that this person starts growing up, and in his teenage years, he decides he has no interest in school or excelling in school. He's not interested in it. And so he performs poorly. Not because he's stupid, but because he's just not interested in it. Now let's say it's time for him to enter the workforce, but he doesn't want to be that doctor or that lawyer or that great athlete. He's not interested in music. He'd rather be an auto mechanic. Perhaps he wants to open up a small pottery shop and teach children how to make pottery, or wine-drinking middle-aged women how to make pottery. And that's all he's interested in, because that's what he loves to do. That's what he wants to do. Imagine these parents, how disappointed they would be. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on genetic modifications to make this person as handsome and strong and intelligent and as talented as possible. And now he's in his 40s just fixing engines in a garage in the middle of Wisconsin, because it's what he loves to do, you know? His family life probably would have been horrible growing up. His parents would have probably put a lot of pressure on him to excel in everything he's been doing, and he'd not have any interest in what his parents want him to be interested in. And this is sort of a thing that most children deal with anyway. Our parents want us to do certain things like, oh, you should become a doctor or a lawyer or this or that. And it's like, I think I'd rather just play my guitar. And it just causes lifelong problems with your parents. Now, imagine how much worse that would be if your parents had genetic expectations of you and spent the time and money to do these things. You could imagine how much more broken a person like that would be in their adulthood. Now imagine the other set of parents. They decide they want to have a child. They just fall in love. They have intercourse and conceive a child naturally. They let nature and God run its course. A child is produced. And let's say this child has severe Down syndrome, or some other congenital defect, or some other non-normal function. Now, something that I've seen in my life, because I know many parents who have children like this, they are saints, essentially. These parents are capable of the deepest compassion, the most infinite, unconditional love I've ever seen. These children will grow up, and for their whole lives, their parents will have to support them. Their entire lives. And of course, when their parents die, these children still need support in their 40s, 50s, and they have to get support elsewhere now. And their parents supported them for the length of their entire lives. And they're fine with it. Well, I mean, of course, it's extremely difficult. I'm not saying they're fine with it. It's a challenging life. What I mean is, these parents generally don't resent or hate their child. And I've noticed that the ones who initially do resent and hate their child in early youth, because like, oh, my child has non-normal functioning. This is going to be extremely difficult. My life is ruined. And for a few years, they may resent and hate their child. They may be horrid, selfish people and going through a very difficult time. But eventually they snap out of it. Something expands within them, grows with them. It's like their heart chakra expands. And these horrid, selfish people become selfless, compassionate, saintly people, suddenly capable of unconditional love for their child. And they were not capable of this love before, but now they are, because they had a handicapped child. If they did not have that handicapped child, they may have remained selfish, horrible people for the remainder of their lives, and the world would have fewer saints in it. And that child, even though it has perhaps a physical and mental low quality of life, it experiences unconditional love for the entirety of their life. Many of these handicapped children with these wonderful parents have lives that are absolutely filled to the brim with unconditional love. So which life is better? The life of a handicapped child whose life is filled with love, or the life of a genetically perfect child whose life is absent love? This is a question we have to ask. I don't have an answer. I have an opinion. I don't really care to share it. I'm sure you can extrapolate. If you have watched some of my videos and you know what kind of person I am so far, you can probably guess. But it's not important. It's not up to me to decide what is right and what is wrong. It's up to parents and individuals who wish to use transhuman technologies or not, whether to use them or not, if it's a good thing or not. and to consider, are we really wise enough to make this decision? Do we really know what constitutes a high quality of life? How do you measure the quality of life? Is it a physical, biological metric? Is it a mental metric, a spiritual metric, an economic metric? How do you determine what is a high quality life? And how are you wise enough to know what types of choices you make before you're pregnant, while you're pregnant, after the child's born, in the child's life? When the child becomes an adult, he begins making his own decisions. This whole range of decisions, this entire timeline of decisions that we make. How do we know what are the correct decisions, what are the incorrect decisions, what are the moral ones, the immoral ones, the ethical ones, the unethical ones, the effective ones, the ineffective ones? What kind of consequences they will have or not, intended or otherwise? How are we wise enough to know these things? This is my issue with transhumanists, because they don't want to have this debate. They don't want to think about these questions. They just assume everything will be better if you apply these technologies. And they give these token arguments about the possible consequences, about the possible bad things that might result from the applications of these technologies, and they skirt over it, they go by it really fast, and then they just assume that these things won't be that bad, and they move on. I don't know how many documentaries and interviews I've seen about transhumanism and how they just give these token little softball answers regarding the consequences of these technologies, and no one really thinks about it on a deep level. And the question I just posed to you, the difference between these two children, genetically perfect child or a handicapped child, and their family dynamic, this is an old question in bioethics. Actually, somebody thought of it, I can't remember who, somebody thought of it in the 1970s, when people very early on began thinking about potential genetic modifications to humans and stuff like that, because there were a lot of sci-fi novels coming out about it back then, and so people began thinking about it. So this is not a new question, but transhumanists hate it when you pose it to them, and it's a very popular question. I didn't make it up. This is something I took from a bioethics textbook that I read, I think in 2003. And it amazes me that it is such a poignant question about what kind of wisdom do we contain, what is the quality of life, how do we determine what quality of life is, and do we have a right to apply these technologies? Because it makes me think of the stratification of society. It might seem like a stretch. Let me extrapolate for you. We've seen in the last 3 years that there is a desire within certain think tanks, certain financial and economic groups, certain government groups, and even within the population at large, that there is a desire to stratify society into two different classes of people. Those who go along with the medical tyranny and those who do not. Those who have received the jab and those who have not. And the ones who want to stratify society believe that the jab is the best thing, or that everybody should have gotten it. And it reminds me of medieval Catholics and communion and their beliefs in their religion. You had, during the Inquisition, you had to prove you were a Catholic by going to Mass and receiving communion. You know, the bread and the wine and the prayer that you believe in Christ. And when you did this, you were no longer considered a pagan or a heathen, and you were accepted into the citizenship of Europe, or of the city-states of Europe. And those who did not receive communion, or refused communion, were much of the time murdered, tortured, or simply cast out of their society, ostracized, ridiculed, mocked, attacked. Their rights were revoked, their privileges were revoked, and things of this nature, because they did not confess belief in the church and they refused communion. You see the same thing with the biomedical tyranny occurring today. You know, the jab is like your communion. You go to the church of the medical office, you have the high priest of science, the doctor administering the communion that is the jab. And the act of receiving the jab is proving that you believe in the religion of modern medical science, and that you do not believe in homeopathy, chiropractic, alternative ways of healing yourself or of preventing disease. You are turning your back on the ancient ways of protecting yourself from illness, and you are accepting the new medical science as your religion. And you have to prove it. And if you refuse it, then you are seen as filthy, disgusting, dangerous, a burden to society. I mean, I've seen this in my own life and in the lives of close friends and family, that people who choose not to get their children are yelled at, literally yelled at, sometimes in public. They say things like, oh, you don't love your child, or you don't want to give your child the best chance at life. Why wouldn't you get your child? Do you hate your child? You're a burden to society. You're spreading disease. You're disgusting. You're dangerous. You're evil. You're causing problems for everybody. Your children are going to die. You're going to die. Everyone's going to die. The children around your children are going to die. You're ruining life for all of us. You're such a bad person. And they're accused of not loving their children, when the opposite is the truth. They love their children so deeply they just don't want to poison them. They have a different idea of what health and quality of life is. Where else have we heard that you're filthy, you're disgusting, you're a burden on society, we don't like you, you're terrible, you need your rights and privileges revoked? The Catholic Inquisition is one, the example I used earlier. Manifest Destiny across America, the way the Dutch and the English treated Native Americans, the Bolshevik Revolution, the way people who, traditionalists and czarists were treated by the communists, and in the Nazi era, how the Nazis treated Jewish people. It's the same thing. So you have this desire to stratify society in the way that the worst governments and the worst, most horrific episodes of tyranny wanted to stratify society, saw the stratification occur. With just complete hatred, a disgust of the people that don't believe what you believe in, to the point where you want to kill them. You want to get rid of them. You want them out of your life, and you're going to scream at them and you're going to yell at them. Now, this ties in with transhumanism and the desire for transhumanism. Imagine a society where genetic modification is normal, commonplace. Let's say it's cheap. Let's say it's covered by insurance. It's so readily available for your child. You can do the designer baby thing. You can make sure your child will be immune to disease, won't have any congenital or inherited issues, things like that. And you decide, there'll be a group of people who are into it and a group of people who don't want anything to do with it. And you will probably see the people who love the genetic modifications will absolutely hate the people who prefer natural life, natural conception, natural birth. And the natural, whatever God and nature wants is what we'll go with, and we'll make the best of it. You'll have people saying, oh, what, you don't love your child? You don't want the best for your child? You don't want to give your child the best chance? It's covered by insurance. Why don't you just do it? Why don't you just get the genetic modifications? It's super cheap and available, and we all do it. All of us do it. You can have a 6'2", strong, athletic, intelligent person who has no diseases at all. Why wouldn't you want that for your kid? You must hate your child. You must hate society. You must hate yourself. What's wrong with you? Do it. We all do it. But the reason that they choose not to do it is because they love their child deeply, and because they have faith that everything will work out the way it's meant to, for themselves, for their lives. They will have unconditional love for their child no matter what that child is like, and they will make the best of that child's life no matter what. And they prefer not to tamper with nature. Perhaps they have the opinion that we are not smart enough, intelligent enough, or wise enough to be able to know the long-term consequences of genetic and mechanical tampering with our bodies. in the short term, it might seem great. Oh, look, we're all handsome and beautiful and we're all healthy and lovely. But you know how spoiled people are? They go through their whole lives. Everything's so good for them. Everything's so great. Everything's handed to them on a silver platter. They never suffer. They never so much as stub their toe on the coffee table. They don't get sick. Everybody tells them how great they are. They do well at everything. That everything just kind of falls into place for them. And then maybe they get into their 20s. And at the first sign of trouble, these people fall apart. At the first little resistance to their lives, these people fall flat on their faces. They kick and cry like little toddlers throwing temper tantrums. They break down. They commit suicide. They lose their minds. They become alcoholics and drug addicts. They have no idea how to handle difficulty because they've been pampered and spoiled for their entire lives, and they've never develops the spiritual faculties that are developed through suffering. When you suffer, you learn forbearance, you learn forgiveness, you learn mental fortitude and internal strength, you learn how to overcome things through internal spiritual freedom, you learn how to deal and adapt with problems around you. You learn how to see things from different perspectives. You learn how to regulate your emotions. You learn how to regulate your reactions to external stimuli. You find out where your triggers are within your heart and soul, and you learn how to get rid of them so that you can have serenity and peace. Suffering results in a lot of very, very beneficial spiritual developments. And if you are born genetically perfect, with the world unfolding before you, in ease and comfort, I imagine you would be a very, very weak person. You would miss many opportunities to develop spiritually and mentally. You would probably be a dangerous person. You've seen maybe The Wrath of Khan, the Star Trek film by Gene Roddenberry. That guy was genetically perfect. He had the mind of a master strategist, the insight of an expert psychologist. He had like the strength of a bull, but he had the emotional maturity of like a 10-year-old boy. And as soon as someone rubbed him the wrong way, he sought vengeance against them. He would destroy everything for the sake of seeking vengeance because he was so emotionally unstable. One thing goes wrong in his life and he loses his mind and puts so many people at risk, will destroy whole worlds, whole communities of people just to satisfy his out-of-control emotions, right? It's a great movie. I imagine that could very well be true. I mean, I went to school with kids who had very easy lives. And, you know, God bless them for having good lives. I'm not begrudging them that. But they are very, very fragile people in their adulthood. Very fragile people. And because, you know, they're rubber bumpers on all the corners in their lives. You know what I mean? Like, there were plugs in all the electrical outlets. You know, their parents made sure that everything would work out for them. And these people are a mess today. They're an absolute mess. Drug addicts, alcoholics, abusive in their relationships. It is just not a pretty thing. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what is quality of life? Should we be tampering with genetics and designer babies and all this stuff? Is it actually good for the future? We have to ask ourselves, I think the most important question to ask ourselves when regarding bioethics, when regarding actually any choice we make at all in our lives, is this: will this make my ancestors proud? And will it make my descendants proud? Think of the remote past and the people you came from, and think of the remote future and the people who will be born of you. Will these two groups of people approve of my actions in this life? Are my ancestors shaking their heads in disappointment at me and my choices? Are my descendants embarrassed that I am one of their forefathers? Or are my ancestors cheering me on with pride? And are my descendants proud to call me one of their ancestors? With every choice I make, I think about these two groups of people that technically don't exist. The ancestors are dead, the unborn are unborn. So I think of two groups of people that don't exist and make all of the decisions in my life based on these imaginary people. But they're not really imaginary. They do exist on some level. We know that. We know the future will come. We know the past was here. And that is the core of the issue regarding bioethics. It's thinking about these two groups of people. What are the consequences of these actions? What really is quality of life? Are we supposed to just have easy times here? Or are the difficulties of human life important for our spiritual development? Are we wise enough to know which is which? Maybe some people should have designer babies. Maybe that's part of their karma, part of their destiny, to have a genetically easy life and to have those experiences in this incarnated human experience. Maybe it's somebody else's karma or dharma to be a natural born person and go through all the issues that come with just being a natural human being. Each group of parents, each family, each individual has to reflect and come up with these decisions on their own. And I don't think any one of us has the right to either coerce or hinder any of these decisions in any direction. It's not up to us. It's up to the people who just want to do these things or not want to do these things. But, then how do you write laws based on this stuff? And that's a whole other thing that I'm not smart enough to know. And of course the governments are going to write laws about these technologies. They always do. They always come up with laws regulating advances in medicine and things like that. And these laws are always compromised and they're never perfect. Because that's the nature of law, that's the nature of government. You have to compromise and nothing's perfect, especially in a democracy, where you have to please all these different interest groups. So I'm not even going to get into that, because that's just not my expertise at the moment. And I don't think I'm wise enough to determine what would a good law be and what would a bad law be regarding transhumanist technologies. All I know is what I would do, the decisions I would make. That's all I know. And my opinion is that modern medical technology does not take into account the spiritual faculties of humanity. There's a question I like to ask, another question. I like to ask doctors. I did this a lot years ago because I knew a couple of neuroscientists and a couple of biologists. They held doctorates in these fields. And I would ask them, what is life? These people, right off the bat, I'll tell you, they were materialists and atheists, as most doctorates are in the West. And I would ask, what is life? Tell me. You studied biology. Biology means the study of life. Do you have a definition of life? They don't. They don't have a definition for bio. They use the word bio, life, the Greek word for life, right in the title of their occupation and study, but they do not define life. I say, I'm made up of calcium and carbon and iron and water and this and that and the other, zinc and all these different minerals. And so is that corpse in the morgue. That corpse is made of the same things I am. So why is it that my heart beats and his doesn't? Why is it that my lungs expand with air and his don't? Why is it that I have thoughts and perceptions and he does not? Why is it that I am able to speak? Why is it that I'm able to move my body? I'm able to will myself to pick up this coffee mug. I am able to live and he is not. What is the difference between me and that corpse? And they generally don't have an answer for this. They've generally never even thought about it, which is surprising. Neuroscientists and biologists who don't think about the difference between a dead corpse and a living human. And what is life? Why is one considered alive and one is considered dead? Well, if one is alive and another is dead, but these technologists who are developing transhuman technologies don't understand the difference or don't even think about this, how can they account for life with their technologies? It makes me think of certain prosthetics or certain amputees, many amputees who suffer phantom limb syndrome. They still feel their limb, like say someone lost their hand, they still feel their hand. They still feel like they can move it. This is the ether body. how surprised will these researchers be when they realize that the human being is not just a physical body, but is a physical body, an etheric body, an astral body, a mind, and a spirit. That the human being has all these other bodies, these subtle bodies, not just the one physical. And the etheric body is essentially the same size and shape as the physical body. And the ether is basically the middle ground between matter and spirit. So when a spiritual impulse wants to become matter, it passes through the ether. The ether translates this spiritual impulse into a material manifestation. It works in reverse as well. The ether body, sometimes we know it as our chakras. One of the most basic functions of the ether body is the autonomic biological functions. Your heart beats, and you don't have to think about your heart beating, it just does it on its own, because the ether body regulates that. When you eat food, you don't have to think about digesting that food and extracting nutrients and transmuting the food into energy and physical body mass and where to distribute the nutrients and energy throughout your body. Imagine if you had to think about that while eating. Imagine if you had to actually know how to digest food and use the energy and nutrients. I mean, the intelligence required to digest and utilize food is more superior than any human brain or human mind or even any supercomputer could do. The knowledge and intelligence required to digest food is of such a high order that it is unfathomable. How can your body and your ether body transmute food into life force? It's essentially miraculous, for lack of a better word. It's fascinating. It is phenomenal. It's amazing. And this is what the ether body does. And according to Rudolf Steiner, the ether body is regulated by very, very high spiritual intelligences. And our physical bodies, they're regulated by extremely powerful spiritual intelligences, way more powerful than the human brain or the human mind. So how many technologists, biomedical technologists, or transhumanists do you think are taking into account the etheric body, the chakras, and so on, as they develop these new technologies? I would wager it's a number approaching 0. So I really just wanted to mull over some of these bioethical questions that I've been thinking about for a very long time. They started coming back up in modern culture with current events. And I'm just concerned about stratification of society. You know, when we saw the whole fiasco of the last few years, there are certain people who consider themselves to be thoughtful, intelligent, well-educated, well-rounded liberals. And they were the ones who were yelling at people for not wearing masks, calling the police on people who were not wearing face masks, just trying to shame and mock people who didn't get the jab, still do, try to kick those types of people out of their institutions and meetings, kicking them out of family gatherings, like, oh, you didn't get the jab, you can't be around me or my children or my family. You're disgusting, you're a burden on society, all this stuff. And they consider themselves to be like thoughtful, well-rounded liberals. And, you know, they'll peruse the history books and they'll think about Nazi Germany or something like that, and they'll be like, oh, how could all those German citizens just go along with something that was so obviously evil, so obviously oppressive? How stupid were those Germans? I can't believe they fell for that. And then it's like, look in the mirror, darling. If you were alive in the 1930s and 40s in Germany, you would have been a Nazi. You would have been a flag-waving, swastika-wearing maniac just like the rest of those people. Listen to how you talk. Listen to how you hate everyone who thinks differently from you. And you want to stratify society. You think there are certain people who are filthy and dangerous and burdensome to you. What does that sound like? And you wonder how the Germans could have just went along with it. The same way you're going along with it. Have some self-awareness, please. And it's the things like this that made me reconsider bioethics. recently, because like I said, I started studying bioethics like 15 to 20 years ago and just kind of didn't think about it for a long time. And I just wanted to bring it up. I know there wasn't so much about spirituality in here, but there are a few nuggets that I think are important when considering the choices we make. These biomedical choices have to do with what are known as negative selections and positive selections. You know, in the world of biomedicine, negatively selecting for certain treatments or therapies or modalities means to bring someone who has non-normal functioning, like a handicapped person, up to normal human functioning. Now, of course, we can argue about what normal is, but there is a standard textbook definition of normal. You know, you got 10 working fingers, you got a heart that works, lungs that work, a brain that puts you on the same average intelligence as any other person. You know, like, sure, I don't like to define the word normal, but you can get an idea of what normal functioning is and what below normal functioning is. So negative selection is the selection of medical technologies and therapies and modalities that will bring a non-normal person up to normal functioning. So like if you were a paraplegic, but you get a little spinal shunt that reconnected the nerves in your legs and you could walk again, you know, that little spinal shunt, that would be a negative selection because your legs weren't working before, you chose this technology, you put it in your spine, and now your legs work again. And then there's positive selection, which is when you select for biomedical therapies or modalities that bring you to super normal functioning. So like if you got wings implanted in your shoulder blades and you could fly, or if you replaced your eyeballs with robotic eyeballs and you had x-ray vision, or something like that. And you know, you see some not long distance runners, like track runners who are amputees. They like are missing their legs and they get those curved, flexible pieces of metal to replace their legs, and they actually wind up running faster than other people because now their legs are lighter weight. They have lower impact steps because of the flexible metals, the way they're designed. They have more energy because their metabolism is not burning up energy for their leg muscles or as much for their leg muscles. And they actually have an advantage over runners with organic human legs. So that's actually a type of positive selection from a certain point of view, even though it's a mix between negative selection and positive selection, because these people were amputees. They had non-normal functions of their legs brought back up to a normal state with prosthetics, but those prosthetics were also kind of a positive selection because it pushed them over normal functioning. So that's the sort of ethic of transhumanism, is they're obsessed with positive selection. In the 90s and early 2000s, they talked mostly of negative selection to get us interested, to be like, oh, we can heal these issues, we can help these people, we can do this, and that's all well and good. And it's kind of the sugar pill to get you to swallow the rest of it. But what we're really interested in is positive selection. We want to shape human evolution. We want to take control of human evolution, take it out of nature and God's hands, put it into our own hands. And not just on a spiritual level, but on a physical level. And it's just something to think about. You know, we take our spiritual evolution into our own hands. That's easy. It's something we do every day. When we go through everyday life, we develop our spiritual faculties just by dealing with suffering and hardships. We develop forbearance and forgiveness and all those spiritual traits I was describing before. And we make conscious decisions to become better, more spiritually active people. So, like, yeah, we are not unconsciously spiritually evolving. We are consciously evolving. We have taken our spiritual evolution into our own hands. And to an extent, our physical evolution, when we exercise, do yoga, breathing exercises, correct diet, and things of this nature, to an extent, we're taking our physical evolution into our own hands. And then, modern people, transhumanists, want to take it further with genetics and mechanics. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that too far? Is it fine for us? What are the consequences? What aren't the consequences? I don't have any answers. Like I said, I only have my opinion. I would reject these options for myself, for my children. That's just my opinion. That's just my choice. I asked the question about the ancestors and the future, and I don't think I'm wise enough to be able to tamper with what's going on. I just don't think I am. I don't really deal with, I don't really choose modern medicine for a lot of things. I think it's a lot of tampering. I have a sort of hands-off approach to a lot of things in the physical world where, like, if it happens, it happens. I'm not going to lose sleep over getting sick or injured or trying desperately to prevent suffering. It just doesn't really matter to me. So that's my choice. That's my viewpoint. It's like, it doesn't really matter to me. We're going to go through life. Life is going to be whatever life is going to be. I have faith enough in God and in myself that, you know, things will work out the way they're meant to, and I'm not going to stress about it. I'm not going to try and control everything outside of myself. I like to just have peace within myself, despite what's going on outside myself. And that's the other aspect of it. There are two ways of gaining happiness, and one of them is fleeting, one of them is permanent. You can choose happiness within yourself, choose to develop it spiritually, choose to feel it, and that's like a muscle that you can exercise. It's a skill that you can practice. You can choose to feel happy, develop that core of happiness, and you can be happy whether you're in prison or whether you're in a comfortable home, whether you're around friends or whether you're totally alone. You can develop yourself internally where your external circumstances don't matter. You can have a sense of peace and serenity and happiness within you regardless of what's going on outside of you. And then there's the other path, which is I'm going to change everything outside of me until it's comfortable and safe and makes me happy. You know, I'm going to buy new clothes. I'm going to make sure I live in a nice house. I'm going to make sure I have lots of money. I'm going to change everything. I'm going to change my physical body to be something that I want it to be. And instead of working on yourself spiritually, psychologically, and internally and emotionally, you're just going to try and change your environment and your body and try and seek happiness that way. It's my opinion, and I think we have many, many thousands of years of human experience to show that that doesn't work. You can't depend on other people, you can't depend on your environment, you can't depend on your body, and you can't depend on everything outside of yourself to make you happy. It's just not going to work. It just doesn't work. It's just not the way happiness and serenity works. So I tend to have that more hands-off approach, like the world is going to be what the world is going to be, my body is going to do what my body is going to do. I'll do my best to be healthy, diet and exercise and meditation and yoga and regulating my thoughts and emotions. I'm going to do my best to remain healthy and have a high quality of life in the way that I define what a high quality life is. But I'm not going to obsess about it. I'm not going to spend so many resources and so much time trying to perfect my physical and external reality. You know, it's going to be what it's going to be. I'll do the things that I can and not worry about the things that I can't. And I just don't obsess over these types of things. And so that's why personally I'm against most modern medical technologies for myself, not in general, not for society, not for others, for myself. It's why I refuse these things that society wants me to accept. It's why I don't want or care about modern advancements in medicine. I just don't care about them. They don't interest me. I refuse them all. Most of them. Maybe not all of them, but most of them. And that's just where I'm at. And I just believe that I deserve, not that I deserve to be respected, but that people who think like me should be left alone. You know? Like, I'm tired of hearing all this stuff that, that I don't love myself, or I wouldn't love my children, or I wouldn't, like these parents who get accused of not loving their children, or that we all get accused of being a burden on society. It's like, well, we'll prove it. So I just wanted to bring it up. There's just some food for thought. This video is just food for thought. I just, you probably don't want to hear this from some freaking musician from the United States. Like, who really cares about what I think? But it's just a fact that I think, and that we all think, that we all have views, and we all need to think about these things a little bit more these days, because these are not problems just for think tanks and corporate board members and bizarre college students to think about. Now this stuff is invading our lives, and it's changing our culture, it's changing our laws, it's changing our relationships with each other, and it's time we examine these things. And it's not that difficult to think about this stuff. You know, these college professors want you to think that they're the gatekeepers of some esoteric knowledge regarding biomedical science. It's really not that. It's not that difficult to understand. It's not. They just want your tuition money. They want you to think it's difficult to understand so that you pay for their college classes so that they can have some sort of social status, like, oh, they know some secret knowledge about how life works. But again, none of them can even answer the simple question of what is life. So what the hell could they possibly know if they can't even answer that simple basic question? Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you got through this. This was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there's some nuggets for you to chew on, to mull over. Let me know what you think. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Take care.